Okay, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining in. My name is Jonathan Adlist with the FreeMind Group, and I will be giving the webinar today on an introduction to SBIR and STTR funding opportunities. So let's dive right into it. First, few general issues in terms of housekeeping. First of all, I will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so do feel free to type in questions into the question tab, and I'll try to address as many of them as I can towards the end. Additionally, this is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. And also, I will be sending out the slides that I'm using to everybody that attended the webinar. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, in terms of who is speaking with you today, so the FreeMind Group has been around for about 17 years now, 55 full-time employees. We work across the life sciences, academics, medical research centers, and obviously the industry itself, and across the board, everything from the smallest companies out there to some of the largest ones. And currently we submit about 400 to 450 applications a year on behalf of our clients. And basically the way we do what we do is we try to identify the most relevant sources of funding to strategize and help maximize each application's chances of success. We manage complex project production processes, lead the joint application writing, and support the final contract negotiations when that is relevant. Essentially, we view non-dilutive funding as a strategic financial tool, and our multi-submission approach is really what allows us to do that. But enough about us. What we will be discussing today is SBIRs and STTRs. SBIRs are small business innovation research grants, and STTRs are small business technology transfer grants. I couldn't say why they chose the acronym for STTRs. It seems counterintuitive, but that is the acronym regardless. Basically, we will also be discussing the features of SBIRs and STTRs, what the eligibility criteria are for these mechanisms. We'll review various funding opportunities, and we'll look into some additional interesting information about these programs. Should be seeing numbers here. But if this was a full grant, I don't know why it's not showing it. It should be all right. But anyway, basically the budget here is $32.3 billion, and this is from the NIH. Of that, $27 billion is actually going out to extramural research, funding actual research projects. So that's a huge pocket of money, and this is just the NIH. Other institutes do have SBIR mechanisms as well, as we will discuss. So basically, this is a very, very large pocket of money. And taking a slightly more in-depth look into that, this is the categorical spending, again, from the NIH website. And you'll see that they cover essentially any area of research that you can imagine. Obviously, there are areas that are more funded than others, like cancer, neurosciences, infectious diseases, that really do have very substantial amounts of funding devoted to research in those areas. But literally, you will be able to find, no matter what indication your R&D is devoted to, or really where you're positioned in the life sciences, chances are that you will definitely be able to find funding from the NIH and find an institute that is interested in what you're doing, so long obviously as it is innovative and addressing an unmet medical need. But we'll touch on the actual review criteria a bit more in depth towards the end. It is important to mention here that this is these topics are not mutually exclusive, meaning, as an example, if you look at neurosciences, this is not, the $6 billion is not the budget of the NINDS, but it's including everything that went to neurosciences. including funding from the NINDS, but also, as an example, a significant amount of funding for indications like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease go through the National Institute on Aging. So this is something that really aggregates that. The SBIR and STTR programs in general are a congressionally mandated set of programs. And basically what that means is, by law in the United States, any government agency funding research and development with a budget of over $100 million has to devote this year 3% of their budget towards SBIRs and 0.45% of their budget towards STTRs. Next year, that's actually expected to rise with the SBIRs to 3.2. But generally speaking, we're talking about a set-aside portion of the budget that is devoted specifically to small businesses. And they are for small businesses, domestic small businesses that engage in R&D and have potential for commercialization. The mission of these projects is to support scientific excellence and technological innovation through the investment of federal research funds in critical American priorities to build a strong national economy. And so you may be beginning to notice, and we'll, again, this will become a bit more evident further down the line, that although the focus here is scientific, there is definitely a business component here as well, and that is important to keep in mind with SBIRs and STTRs. SBIRs even more so in many cases than STTRs. And the goals of the SBIR and STTR programs are to stimulate technological innovation, meet federal R&D needs, support commercialization of innovations, support small business growth and development, and support socially and economically disadvantaged small businesses and women-owned businesses. If you compare SBIRs to STTRs, first of all, the main difference would be that SBIRs are designed to fuel growth in the private sector and commercialization of innovations, and STTRs are designed to stimulate a partnership of ideas and technologies between the small businesses and usually academics, but in general non-profit research institutes. So that's basically the core difference. SBIRs are for a small business, STTRs are for collaboration and a transfer of technology from an academic institute to a small business and help facilitate that translation. So only U.S. small businesses are eligible, and you must meet all of these criteria in order to be eligible. You have to be a for-profit organization, you have to be located in the United States, you cannot have more than 500 employees, which is the SBA's criteria for what a small business is. You must have at least 51% ownership by U.S. residents or citizens. And in terms of VC backing, you can have either multiple VCs backing you or none. For some reason, which I cannot really provide much insight into, you are not eligible if you're backed by one single VC. So, continuing with the comparison, for an SBIR, the primary investigator must be primarily employed at the small business, and they do permit and even encourage research partnerships. In contrast to that, in the STTR mechanisms, primary employment of the PI is not a requirement, but the formal collaboration with the research institute is most definitely required. It's important to mention at this point that you must meet the eligibility criteria at the time of award and not the time of submission, and that difference may be very important. And this is true, by the way, for the previous slide and the criteria I laid out there as well. So as an example, if the PI that you would like to be the PI on the SBIR is not currently employed by the company, or maybe not primarily employed by the company, you can still submit the SBIR so long as when you collect the award, at that time, the PI will be primarily employed by the company, and that can even be dependent on receiving the SBIR. So you can decide you want to employ him to receive the SBIR, which is something that could be very useful. We'll start by looking at the NIH. Like I said, this is not the only source of SBIRs, but it is a very, very major source of SBIRs in the life sciences. As I mentioned, it is very hard to compete with their budget, $32.31 billion with a B. And in general, SBIRs are a phased program, typically phase 1 and phase 2, but we'll see there are some exceptions to that. And the goal of a phase 1 is to establish the technical merit, the feasibility, and the commercial potential of the proposed R&D effort. So it's something fairly initial. And for that reason, since it is initial and it's not, looking forward 3 years of research, something that's very costly, animal models, clinical trials, anything like that, it's more initial than that. The budget is up to $225,000. Actually, it's $150,000 that can be exceeded by 50%. So it's up to $225,000 total. And this is total cost. So this is including both the direct costs and the indirect costs. And this is research that will be conducted over up to 6 months. So a short period of time as well. The STTRs are a very similar budget, also $225,000. In this case, up to 1 year of research, not 6 months. Phase 2 is basically designed to continue the efforts initiated in a phase 1. And this is obviously much more substantial. We're talking about up to $1.5 million, again, total costs. And again, this is technically $1 million that can be exceeded by 50%. And in this case, over 2 years, and this is true for both the SBIRs and the STTRs. So phase 2 is something you would classically submit once you've completed the phase 1 successfully. And now we'll take a look at a few exceptions to that. First of all, before we look at the exceptions to that chronological order, we'll touch on another exception that's not really an exception, it's just not very well known in many cases, and that is a phase 2B. Phase 2B is basically a competing renewal, meaning it's a renewal of the phase 2, but you have to submit an application and you're competing for that renewal. And the goal here is basically to bridge phase 2 and commercialization. So again, similar budgets, but it's interesting to note that, and this is, like I said, not a very well-known fact, that after you've received phase 2, sometimes you can get another $1.5 million for continuation of the work. A Fasttrack award is basically when you submit a phase 1 and a phase 2 together as one single application, and they're both submitted and reviewed as a single application. There are a few advantages to this, and I think most noteworthy of those advantages is the fact that this eliminates the gap of time that is created when you submit a phase 1 separately, and then once you complete the phase 1, you submit for a phase 2. And that time gap is essentially comprised of the period of time that is required from you when you finish the research successfully that you laid out in the phase 1. You must produce the application for a phase 2, which takes a bit of time. And then also you must wait for the entire review process, which put together can easily be a year. When you submit a fast track, that time gap is completely eliminated as soon as you successfully complete the milestones that you suggested as what would be the determination of successfully completing the phase 1. Immediately you continue on to the phase 2 and receive that funding with no time gap in between the two. Obviously, you're asking for more money in this case, so you have to justify that, and there are considerations to here and there in terms of what you should submit. If you should submit a phase 1, wait to complete it, and then submit a phase 2, or go ahead straight away and submit a fast track. And that's something that really should be examined on a case-to-case basis. But in general, the fast track is a fantastic way to go about doing this, and we definitely utilize that when it's relevant with our clients. A mechanism that has not been around for many years, and this is probably even less known than the phase 2B and the fast track, is a direct to phase 2 SBIR. And basically what you can do here is And by the way, the previous examples I gave were relevant for SBIRs and STTRs. This is an exception to that. This really is only relevant for SBIRs and not STTRs. And basically what it is, you can now submit an SBIR Phase 2, even if you have not successfully submitted, been awarded, and completed the research on a Phase 1. The only stipulation is you must have performed work that is equivalent to a Phase 1, which in most cases any company considering to submit a Phase 2 has done, so it's not really much of a requirement. This is a fantastic mechanism. It lets you go straight away for the 1.5 million without really waiting with the 225,000. And again, obviously depending on the stage of research, this could be a very elegant way to bypass that. In terms of the due dates and hopefully the subsequent award, so the upcoming due date for both Phase 1 and Phase 2, and this is with the NIH, is January 5th. And if you submit January 5th, you're expected hopefully to be awarded sometime around July. April 5th is the next deadline, and in that case, the award will hopefully be sometime around September. And I say hopefully not because you'll hopefully get the response. You will get the response, but hopefully you'll be awarded. And September 5th, if you submit, you can expect the award, again, hopefully sometime around April of 2018. This is obviously September 2017. It is important to mention that some mechanisms do have non-standard due dates, so this is correct for all mechanisms that have standard due dates, and that is the vast majority of the mechanisms, but I do feel it's important to mention that this is not universally true. So looking at the routes you can take to approach these sources of funding, basically you have a set of solicited SBIR, then I'll give you a few examples of specific solicitations that are SBIRs. And you also have the unsolicited mechanisms, the investigator-initiated parent announcements that have no specific scientific guidelines or requirements. Essentially, you're suggesting your ideas. You do have to direct it to the right institute and choose the right study section to make sure you're submitting it to people who are interested in funding what you do. But there's no specific requirements in terms of the indication, the stage of development, the area of research, anything like that. So anybody positioned in any area of science that is of interest to the NIH or any of the institutes within the NIH can use these mechanisms. And actually, most of the funding fairly consistently, goes out through these unsolicited mechanisms. So it's a very important thing to note and implement as well. Most of the funding goes out through the unsolicited mechanism. So even if you go on the NIH website and you search for SBIR that could be relevant for you, even if you don't find anything that is a perfect fit for what you do, that really does not mean much. If you find something, then definitely you should use that because it would be more focused on what you're trying to do, and that's great. But not having that perfect fit in terms of a solicitation means very, very little in terms of your chances of actually receiving an SBIR, and that's something that's very important. So let's look at the announcements themselves. So first of all, the parent announcements. The first one here is the parent announcement for SBIRs. That is the honorable solicitation for the NIH, CDC, FDA, and ACF for small business innovation research grant applications. And basically, as I mentioned, Phase 1 up to 225,000 up to 6 months. Phase 2 up to 1.5 million up to 2 years of research. In contrast to that, the STTR program is actually very similar. Like I said, the only real difference in terms of the budget and the timing is the 1-year period for the Phase 1. The next deadline for all of these is January 5th. So if you are considering making a submission or submissions, you most definitely should get to it. The parent announcement for the direct to Phase 2 is a different mechanism, but it is essentially very similar to parent announcement, open to all areas of research that are of interest to any of the institutes within the NIH. And funding here is identical to the Phase 2. 1.5 million over up to 2 years. And as I mentioned, this is relevant only for SBIRs. Again, same deadline, upcoming deadline is January 5th. Taking a look now at the NSF, the NSF basically has a very similar system, phase 1, phase 2. There are a few differences. First of all, the phase 1 here is up to 150,000, not 225, and it is up to 6 months. And the phase 2 is 750,000 over 2 years. So the budget is somewhat lower, but if what you're doing is a good fit for the NSF, it's a fantastic source of funding. Success rates here are slightly better than with the NIH, and it's really something that we highly suggest if you are a good fit. And they're looking for early stage R&D for small businesses based on innovative transformational technology with potential for great commercial and or societal benefits. The program invites proposals from small businesses across the board, a broad range of science and engineering disciplines. And some selected topics they're currently interested in are advanced materials and instrumentation, biological technologies, smart health, and biomedical technologies. So it is a bit more technology-oriented than life sciences-oriented, but you most definitely can find the right way, if you're relevant, to fund life science projects with the NSF as well. And it's definitely something worth looking into, and I have a link here for the topics they're interested in if you're looking to submit. The next deadline is really coming around very soon. It's December 6th, and the following deadline will be in June. In terms of a comparison between SBIRs and STTRs, and there's a mistake here in the slide, so I will correct this before I send it out. The deadlines here noted for the STTRs are actually the NSF deadlines, so please disregard that. The SBIR deadlines and the STTR deadlines of the upcoming ones are January 2017 and April 2017. Funding, again, my apologies, this slide is a bit off. Basically, the point here is a comparison of the SBIRs and STTRs. So going back April and January, phase 1, the main difference would be the 6-month period in contrast to the 12-month period. In terms of the PI within SBIR, there's a minimum 1 calendar month requirement to devote to the project, and in STTR it's 2 months, but it is important to note, and this is, you can see at the bottom, you have to factor in the percentage. So as an example, 10% of PI's time over 12 months is considered 1.2 calendar months, and 10% over 6 months would be 0.6 calendar months. And generally speaking, we're talking about feasibility and commercialization plan for phase 1 and prototype development for phase 2. Here we go. Oh, I'm sorry, this is for the NSF. My apologies here. This is not a comparison with the NIH. So that's the discrepancy with the numbers. I apologize. Looking at some solicited SBIR and STTR opportunities, as I mentioned, the SBIR and STTR mechanisms are from various organizations. These examples are from the NIH, and there is a very long list. There are currently 88 open SBIRs and STTRs from the NIH. And a few examples that I've added here, there are a few that from clinical trials, like the first 2 here, the NIDDK exploratory clinical trials for small businesses, and the NIAID SBIR phase 2 clinical trial implementation cooperative agreement. A lot of different, I won't read them all off for you here, I won't bore you with that, but generally speaking, I definitely recommend going on the NIH website and looking for things that are a good fit. There are a lot of different opportunities out there, and many of them could be very relevant for what you're doing. There are definitely some challenges when submitting an SBIR and STTR. Generally speaking, you must, with an SBIR, phase 1, conduct at least 67% of the work in-house, and with the phase 2, at least 50% of the work. With STTR, those numbers are different, at least 40% by the company, at least 30% by the academic collaborator. Now, there are certain ways around that in the case of virtual companies, but generally speaking, those are the requirements. You should present it as something that is product development driven, something that is milestone based. That is very different from the approach with other types of grants like R01s and R21s, where it is hypothesis driven, and that is an important distinction. There are some atypical sections to this type of application, commercialization plan, and again, the language you'll have to use here is usually much more, I guess, business language than science language. So in many cases, the scientists producing these applications can be less familiar with how to produce that in the right way. And in general, there are a few sections that you will not find in other grants. And it's very important to create a consolidated, coherent, and responsive application. Responsive meaning you are responding to what their either solicitation is or their current need is. In hopes if you do all of that, you will be reviewed favorably. And basically, if we can touch for a moment on the review process itself, and this is taken from the NIH, but this is very true across the board regardless of the source of funding. There are 5 criteria: leadership, environment, significance, and innovation, and also scientific approach. Now, the answer with regards to the question, do you have the right leadership? Do you have the right environment? Is it significant? Is it a real innovation? The answer most definitely must be yes for you to have a chance at being awarded. But what will get you awarded, ultimately, is a top-notch scientific approach. And basically this process, as far as the funding agencies are concerned, is a risk management process. They are essentially weighing the risks against the strengths of your application. So knowing how to present your application in the right way to convey the strengths, but also to mitigate the risks, and in most cases even address the risks and show you have a plan for addressing what the problems may be. That is typically the best way to get favorably reviewed and hopefully awarded. The way in our experience to maximize your chances is to take of being funded in general is to have a systematic approach. You have to know what they're looking for. You have to, as I mentioned, present a complete focused project. You have to ask for what is necessary. Don't ask for too much. Asking for too much is obviously something that will be scrutinized. But also do not ask for much less than what the actual cost will be in hopes that it will make the investment easier for them, because they will view that as you not really understanding what you're asking. They fund 100% of the project. So if you're proposing a project and the cost is X, ask for X. And also leverage, when relevant, on research collaborations. Don't leverage on a collaboration just for the sake of the collaboration. Collaborate with a party that is relevant and that their capabilities really do address the needs of the project. Essentially, the point is to cover all the different facets of what you're proposing. And if you're missing a set of capabilities, by all means, you could bring somebody on, or you could collaborate with somebody that has those capabilities. With the case, in the case of the STTRs, you have to collaborate regardless. But again, you still should make it relevant to the science and not just collaborate to qualify for an STTR. And you also have to target the right mechanism. There are a lot of different pockets of money. As I mentioned, there are 88 current open SBIRs and STTRs just from the NIH. You have to find the right one, or if there isn't a good fit there, you have to use the investigator-initiated mechanisms. But again, finding the right pocket of money in that case would be directing it to the right agency that is currently interested in what you're trying to do, finding the right study section to review it. We definitely advocate conducting a thorough strategic assessment, outlining all the different sources of funding that could be relevant for each one of your pipeline projects, and based on that, creating a multi-submission granting strategy. We find that really is the only way to take this source of funding and make it something that reliably produces results. And basically our approach is essentially consists of 2 core elements. The first one is the strategic assessment that I just mentioned, creating a long-term strategy for each one of your projects. And then the second part is actually producing the applications. And these two obviously go hand in hand, producing application after application, going back, looking at the strategy, deciding what the next application is, and submitting that as well. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. I hope you find it to be informative. At this point, I will take some questions. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to add those in the questions tab below. So let me just take a look here. So first of all, there's a question here about the slides. I will be sending them out, so no worries. Let me just see here. So there's a question here about clinical trials. More specifically, IND requirements, phase 1, phase 2, things like that. In general, that depends on the specific mechanism. In general, it is best, if possible, to fund clinical trials via a mechanism that is intended to fund clinical trials, and in that case, it will be very clearly specified in the actual solicitation. You can technically, until September of 2017, so the next 3 deadlines, you can fund clinical trials through the parent announcement, through the omnibus investigator-initiated mechanisms, but the NIH actually just last month issued a notice that that will be ending, and they will be issuing soon basically a set of specific mechanisms for funding clinical trials. Since those have not yet been issued, it's hard for me to comment on exactly how they will look. But as soon as they are issued, obviously we'll be talking about them. So that's something I'd be more than happy to discuss in the future. And I hope that answers your question here. The question here about virtual companies. Let me see. Okay, so basically I didn't really go into this in depth when I mentioned that these the requirements for 67 or 50% of the work to be carried out in-house are required for with SBIRs. Basically, in our experience, you can in many cases outsource work to a CRO as an example, but if you receive from them the raw data and you analyze it yourself, that can in many cases be counted as work that you carried out in-house. So that is a workaround we've found that it can be very useful for virtual companies. Also, that is something that has to be discussed on a case-to-case basis. You have to make sure you don't just go ahead as a virtual company and submit without making sure this is relevant. We have precedents of this working in the past, and we've done it multiple times. But I wouldn't suggest just going ahead and trying to make that happen, assuming it's okay, because that is not the standard. Will you have enough time to submit January? Yes, absolutely. This webinar is timed in light of that fact. You most definitely have to get working soon. The typical amount of time we take to produce an application is about 4 to 6 weeks. Probably if you're producing it without a specialized firm, it'll take you a bit more than that, but regardless, there still is enough time to meet the January 5th deadline. And let me see here if there are any additional questions. Yes, okay, so foreign company with a U.S. subsidiary. It depends on the ownership structure. There's no one answer for that. What I would say, or rather suggest, is that you go on the SBA website, Small Business Administration, excuse me, and their requirements are obviously a bit more specific than the 6 bullet points I laid out earlier, and all of the detailed information can be found at the SBA website. Okay, I don't think there are any additional questions. So if that is all, thank you all for joining in. Please do feel free to reach out to me, and this is my email here on the screen right now, with any additional questions that could be specifically relevant for you. And I hope you join us next time. Thank you very much.